Chapter 3. Round the World with the Battle Cruisers. In 1923, the Royal Navy was going through great changes. The so-called Geddes axe was being wielded in a drastic pruning of the officer ranks. Named after the First Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Eric Geddes, the cuts were in practice less drastic than the future needs of the service required, so that by the end of 1924 the Navy had more lieutenant commanders than it had at the end of the war. Lieutenant Kenneth Atkinson not only escaped the axe, but was given a prestigious appointment to Hms Hood, flagship of the Special Service Squadron, which was formed to show the flag to the Empire in a world cruise. No doubt the objective was to prove that Britain, though exhausted and impoverished by World War I, was still the most powerful naval force in the world, and also perhaps to thank the Empire for its efforts during the war. Cuts were also being made to the size of the fleet. Most of the battleships that had fought at Jutland were being sold for scrap. Only the former 5th Battle Squadron, including the Warspite, together with the Royal Oak and Revenge, were retained in the active fleet. The Centurion became a radio-controlled target ship in the 1930s. Angelico's flagship, the Iron Duke, survived until after World War II, latterly as a base ship and floating anti-aircraft platform at Scapa Flow. The battle cruisers, which had performed so badly at Jutland, 3 of them being sunk in the battle, all went in 1922. Only Beatty's flagship, the Lion, survived a couple of years longer, and its sister, the Tiger, until 1931. However, 2 of the R-class battleships had been redesigned early in the war as battle cruisers, the Repulse and the Renown, but were only commissioned after the Battle of Jutland. The last battle cruiser to be built for the Royal Navy, Hms Hood, was launched in 1920. The Repulse and the Hood formed the core of the Special Service Squadron, together with the light cruisers Delhi, Denai, Dragon and the Dauntless, under 5,000 tons each and completed after July 1918. The Hood, at 46,200 tons fully loaded, was the largest ship in the Royal Navy until World War II. The Repulse, at around 37,000 tons, was also larger than the British battleships of her day. Battle cruisers were designed to have greater speed than contemporary battleships, at the expense of heavy armour. For instance, the Repulse was designed for over 30 knots as compared with the 21 knots of the contemporary R-class battleships. The Hood, in 1923, was designed for 32 knots. None of the squadrons saw action in World War I, though the Royal Navy suffered the tragic loss of both the heavy ships in World War II. The whole squadron represented the latest and the best of Britain's post-World War I strength, and no doubt the crews were hand-picked for this special service. The total distance travelled on the cruise was 38,152 nautical miles, equivalent to nearly twice the circumference of the world at the equator. The countries of the Empire visited are shown on the map below in a darker tint representing the traditional red. This was the Empire on which, in Kipling's words, the sun never set. HMS SS, Hood, Delhi and the Dauntless were manned, no women of course in those days, from Devonport and started their voyage from there on the 27th of November 1923, finishing at the same port on the 29th of September 1924. The rest of the squadron were variously from the other 2 manning ports, Portsmouth and Chatham, all meeting in the Channel. Of the 10 months of the voyage, a considerable amount of time was spent in port, the equivalent of some 3 months. The ports visited were mainly those of the Empire. The longest stops were in the various ports of Australia, more than 30 days, and New Zealand and Canada, and its adjuncts not far behind. In recognition of the crucial part played by the United States in winning World War I, courtesy calls were also made to Honolulu and San Francisco. At most of the ports there was a standard routine, a reception of the local dignitaries on board, a ball thrown by the governor, and at home on board a sort of cocktail party, a ceremonial march of the ship's companies, and then, where appropriate, the ship was open to visitors from the public. In many ports the officers were allocated to hosts from the local community who looked after them when ashore, and in several cases put them up in their own homes for part of the stay. After the official functions, there were also very often private dinner parties and dances, either in local hotels or residents' homes. Late nights were more frequent than not, often getting back to bed at 3 or 4 a.m. Sport was also prominent in several places. Ken played tennis frequently, golf and hockey occasionally when the season and temperature were appropriate. Between these hectic and usually highly enjoyable nights and days there were spells of duty, often boring and sometimes swapped if a particular attraction were offered. Reading Ken's diary, one can understand why dancing was on the curriculum at Osborne, and also how the colonial life of these British dominions in the 1920s was reflected palely on the social round, which Ken was later to report from Singapore at an uneasy peace nearly 20 years later. The diary starts on Tuesday, the 27th of November 1923, when the ship left Devonport, but the first few pages are illegible from water damage, so there is no record of Ken's reaction to the first port of call, Freetown, Sierra Leone. Cape Town was reached on Saturday, the 22nd of December in vile weather, soon after 7 a.m., the big ships anchoring in Table Bay, about a mile from the dockyard, with the light cruisers going alongside the wall inside the basin. There was an unseasonable thunderstorm during the night, and the wind was blowing from the northwest, entirely against the rules, and a big swell all day, making boat work rather difficult. Ken was greatly impressed by Table Mountain, which he likened to Gib. On Sunday, Ken went ashore in the afternoon and eventually found some cousins of his, whom he hadn't met before. Later he went on to play 6 sets of tennis, and on Monday a brigade from the fleet marched through Cape Town. Ken played tennis again later, though it was getting much hotter, and a southeasterly wind got up in the evening, giving them quite a bad night out in Table Bay. Tuesday, the 25th of December, was, of course, Christmas Day, with a stand-up service on the quarterdeck. A south-east gale made boat work difficult and prevented the landing of church parties. The officers went the rounds of the mess decks, as was the custom, and Bowlby and Ken had to sing a song on the top men's mess deck. It was difficult to imagine it was Christmas time, as it was quite hot, and, mainly owing to the difficulty of getting ashore, everyone was rather mouldy. After a very good lunch in the gunroom, Benson, Gladstone, Craven and Ken did manage to get ashore, and went on the former two's motorbikes round the peninsula. It was a wonderful ride, the road for a great deal of the way being cut out of the mountainside. On the way back they visited the Rhodes Memorial, which was deemed a very fine piece of work. Gladstone and Craven, with Ken, made up the Terrible Three, or the Three Musketeers, referred to later. After the show of military force came the social entertainment, no doubt for the great and good of Cape Town, as defined in those far-off imperial days. There was a dance on board on Wednesday. Ken was on duty and had an excellent time supervising the boat traffic for 1,000 guests to and from the ship in a high wind, so that only one gangway could be used. One can assume he was happier doing his professional duty. Next day there was a howling southeasterly gale all day, and boat traffic was stopped for 12 hours. However, on Friday the 28th, the SS Demosthenes, carrying Ken's mother and sister Violet, arrived in Cape Town at 8 a.m. They were on their way out to New Zealand, visiting members of their family. In South Africa, they were on their way to visit Violet's Aunt Margaret, Peggy. Ken went ashore that first day, but his family didn't land until 10:30 a.m., as the ship was in quarantine. However, Ken managed to get ashore every day to meet them despite the continuing bad weather. He and Violet went to a cheerful dance in Wynberg, though Ken had to sleep in Delhi's wardroom, eventually getting back to the Hood at about 2:45 a.m., for about an hour's sleep before keeping the morning watch, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. On the Saturday, 27th of December, Ken took both his visitors to the test ground at Newlands, where he was playing cricket for the Hood against the Western Provinces. Ken made 9 not out of Hood's score of 200 for 9 declared, which suggests that he batted pretty low in the order. He wasn't a regular of the squadron cricket team. Western Provinces won the match easily, scoring 251 for 7. Ken comments that the hitting was terrific on both sides, 500 runs being scored in 4.5 hours, and altogether it was a most enjoyable day. By Sunday, the 30th of December, the gale had died down, and it was a beautiful day, calm and very hot. After church, Ken went ashore and fetched his mother and Violet off to the ship, where they had a pleasant lunch party, Benson joining in. After lunch, they looked round the ship, and then Ken left them sewing in his cabin, whilst he went ashore to meet the remainder of his party. Mr. and Mrs. Macy and Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. Another dance ashore on New Year's Eve, and then on that Tuesday Ken said goodbye to his family. In the evening his cabin was completely flooded out by most of Table Bay, most of his clothes being soaked, including his washing, which had just come on board and had been placed on the bunk. This may be the occasion when his diary got damaged. On Wednesday, the 2nd of January, the ship left Cape Town at about 11:15 a.m., being followed out by various small craft with cheering crowds on board. Over the next few days they steamed round the south of the African continent, calling at Mosul Bay on the 3rd of January. A visit to Port Elizabeth had to be abandoned because of fog, and the ship proceeded to East London at slow speed, arriving early in the morning of the 5th. At both these places the weather was poor, and the ship was lying offshore, deterring all but a few visitors. At 4 p.m. the ship left East London at 17 knots. The distance to Durban appears to be about 340 nautical miles, so at 17 knots this would take 20 hours steaming, the ship arriving off Durban at 11 a.m. on the 6th of January, 19 hours later. Tugs and small boats came out to the ship to have a look. Only a few visitors came alongside, and the ship left 7 hours later. The next few days were spent at sea, and Hood remembered that she was first a warship, and spent time on training evolutions, gunnery, towing, etc. The weather was very nearly as hot as it had been in Sierra Leone, and the ship had gone back into tropical routine. There was also time for deck hockey, a sail bath on the quarterdeck, nearly washed overboard one evening by the sea coming over the QD, bridge and mahjong, and finally a guest night and a midnight bathe. On Saturday, the 12th of January, the squadron arrived in Zanzibar, about 50 minutes before they were expected, causing rather a stir. It looks a topping place, and though hot, there is a lovely cooling breeze. It's a coralline island, completely surrounded by a coral reef, except of course for the channel, and I should think there's any danger here of rough sea like we had at the Cape, which is a great relief. Our arrival, of course, was celebrated with the usual salutes and official calls, and also we dressed ship overall in honour of the Sultan. Ken has some rather critical comments about the appearance of the Uss Concord, which was on her maiden cruise. She had been commissioned in November 1923, so was a very modern cruiser, but Ken's description makes her sound old, with her guns in round barbettes rather than turrets or open shields. Barbettes were unusual in modern warships of that period. Concord's speed was listed in Wikipedia as 34 knots, and her main armament was 6-inch guns. She operated throughout World War II and was sold for scrap in 1947. Hood was at Zanzibar from the 12th to the 17th of January, with the usual church parties, including a special service for the squadron in the cathedral. A tennis match against the island, the ship's side getting badly beaten, a route march in terrible heat, a drive round the island in the commander's car, and a bathe in the sea. A game of hockey against a Goanese team which the ship eventually won 5-4 after what Ken described as the longest 10 minutes in his life of extra time. A squadron dance was held, which Ken thoroughly enjoyed and was very sorry when it was over at 1 a.m. Tuesday the 15th was the hottest day of the cruise so far, Ken surmised, with no breath of wind. On Wednesday, the 16th of January, the Sultan and all his followers came on board and inspected the ship, and went for a trip in the CMB, coastal motorboat. Later, Ken played in another frightfully fast hockey match against the Europeans, which Hood narrowly lost. They left Zanzibar at 11:15 a.m. on Wednesday, and Ken commented that he was very sorry to go. It's a ripping place, and personally I think the best we've been to so far, but we've only just started. It is a feature of Ken's learning on this trip that he finds every new place a cause of great wonder, which reaches a crescendo and perhaps social climax in Australia, only evaporating somewhat with the final return to the Northern Hemisphere. The next week after leaving Zanzibar was spent at sea, and more training with the different guns, 15-inch and 5.5-inch, and torpedoes. It sounds rather a boring few days, with the weather continuing to be very hot. They were thankful for being in tropical rig, white shirt and shorts, and for having their sail bath. The ship was steering a steady course to pass through the 8 degrees channel, and so keep a little cooler. The 8-degree channel is north of the equator, between the Laccadive Islands and the Maldives. The latitude of Zanzibar is approximately 7 degrees south, and their next port of call was Trincomalee in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, at about 9 degrees north. So the squadron must have steamed northeast up the African coast from Zanzibar to pick up the channel, and then more or less due east. On the evening of Thursday, the 24th of January, they had the first rowdy guest night of the Commission, executing Zanzibar war dances for an hour and a half on end, accompanied by Craven, Haynes and Spear on tom-toms, procured for the purpose at Zanzibar. The Admiral and Captain were spectators at this wonderful scene for a short time only. In the end the heat was too much for all of them, although on the whole they were very suitably clad. Trincomalee was reached on Saturday the 26th of January, Ken's 22nd birthday, staying for 5 days, during which they indulged in a shooting expedition, sailing picnics, tennis, an at-home, and the Admiral's dinner party. Ken notes that it was easily the most peaceful place they had been to. A ripping place in some ways, completely landlocked and with hundreds of small islands all covered with dense green jungle. The crews took advantage of the peace to paint ship, provision, etc. The only black spot was that on the 29th one of the motor cars on its way up to Kandy overturned, killing one petty officer from repulse and injuring 7 men. It was very unfortunate, as it marred an otherwise very pleasant stay. This remark about the unfortunate death and injuries seems casual, but this must have been the stiff upper lip, combined with the fact that the more senior officers and men would have lost close friends and comrades under deeply traumatic circumstances during World War I, finished only 5 years earlier. So the death of one man in a road accident may have seemed unfortunate rather than a tragedy. Ken was only 22 years old on this cruise. It was his first time out of Europe, and his often extreme views of places and situations, good and bad, was entirely natural for his age. The squadron sailed from Trincomalee on 31st of January, the battle cruisers heading for Port Swettenham and the light cruisers for Penang. On the 3rd of February they spotted the northern end of Sumatra, keeping land in sight all day, although it was almost impossible to distinguish it owing to mist over the coast. On Monday, the 4th of February, Hood arrived in Port Swettenham, now known as Port Klang, mooring some way up the river about 6:30 p.m., surrounded by low swampy land covered with trees. Port Swettenham itself was out of sight round a bend about 2 miles off. Ken's host at Kuala Lumpur, the capital of the then Federated Malay States, and about 25 miles from Port Swettenham, was, coincidentally, a Mr. R. Swettenham. Ken remarked in his diary, "It's absolutely magnificent the way they've laid themselves out to make us enjoy our stay." The highlight of a busy social program was a magnificent Chinese banquet held at a Chinese school. There were 250 diners altogether, guests and hosts, and Ken thoroughly enjoyed it, getting on quite well with the chopsticks through 9 courses. After dinner, which ended about 10:30 p.m, Ken and his host stopped and talked with 2 of the Chinese, awfully decent fellows, until after midnight, when they went down to the club, getting home at 5 a.m. The next day was Chinese New Year, when they go absolutely off their heads, Ken noted. He played golf in the morning, on a ripping course, which, like everything else on his visit, surprised him by being absolutely first class. Everything here seems to be of the very best. The roads in particular struck me. They are all, even the worst, as good as the best roads in England, and I'm told they're the same all over the States. The country must be absolutely rolling in money. This was a time when the Malay States were the world centre of tin production. The excellent roads facilitated the Japanese advance 17 years later. Golf was followed by bathing at the Lake Club, lunch, and a tropical rainstorm in which 3/4 of an inch, almost 2 centimetres, fell in well under an hour. For the rest of the stay, Ken was either on duty, not seeing much of the ship at home, or in bed with flu, which affected many of his colleagues. On Sunday, the 10th of February, the ship sailed in the early morning and arrived in Singapore at 4:30 p.m. to be greeted by ships of the China Squadron, including HMS Petersfield, which would be Ken's home a few years later. It was very hot and raining most of the time. On Monday the 11th he got up but didn't return to duty, thus missing a hockey match, though he and 4 other convalescents did go for an exhilarating run in the CMB. Inside the harbour, it's a wonderful place with a surprising amount of shipping inside of all different nations, and we also went and had a look at some of the islands outside. Land reclamation has now completely altered the old waterfront of Singapore, so it is a little difficult to visualize this scene. The visit to Singapore saw the usual official functions: a very wet garden party at Government House, the Admiral's dinner on board with the Governor and Commander-in-Chief, and the ships at home, in which it was impossible to go to the upper deck even under awnings. However, hundreds of brave people came off and were given tea in the batteries and the wardroom, which for some reason put Ken into a bad temper. Friday, the 15th of February, was a much better day for the ceremonial route march, the Governor taking the salute on the steps of the Singapore Cricket Club. A long car drive on the forenoon of Saturday, the 16th of February, included a visit to the site of the new naval base on the other side of the island, which Ken found very interesting. He wasn't to know how closely he would be involved in that base and its eventual abandonment almost exactly 18 years later. This trip later visited other spots of interest on the island, including the oil tanks, on which there were 2 groups of 33 large tanks exclusive of some submarine tanks close to the oiling jetty. Burning oil tanks were to be an integral part of the background to the surrender of Singapore in February 1942. On Sunday, the 17th of February, the battlecruisers sailed from Singapore at 10:30 a.m. for Western Australia, cheering the China squadron as they went past the Hawkins. The Dragon was left behind to bury a Marine from the Delhi who had been killed falling down a hatch. That was the 4th death in the squadron, 3 from accidents and 1, A.B. Benja, from malaria. The passage to Fremantle took about 10 days, and Ken's account is mainly of the weather. On the 19th of February they passed through the Sunda Straits and went close to Krakatoa, which in 1883 had produced the most violent volcanic eruption ever experienced, killing thousands of people in Java and Sumatra, and being felt as far off as England. Sunda Strait lies between Java and Sumatra, so the islands mentioned must have included some of those on the south of Singapore, through which Ken passed on his last journey in 1942. Hood may even have passed through the Banker Strait. Next day they came close to Christmas Island in the afternoon, but there was too much swell to allow communication, so they only went within about 3 to 5 miles, so that the 1,100 inhabitants could have a look at them. We discovered that they had a wireless installation on the station, and they sent us greetings. It looks a pretty spot, completely covered with trees, and with steep cliffs along nearly the whole of the coast, but I wouldn't care to spend much more than a week there. Wireless radio was still in its early days, and Marconi's experiments with shortwave radio did not take place until a few months later, in July 1923. The next 6 days were spent at sea, with the ship heading south in variably rough weather. Despite the westerly wind on the beam, the ship was hardly rolling at all. The seas were going right over them. Ken remarked to his diary that he had never known a ship so steady. The weather got cooler as the southeast trade winds and the sea went down a bit, but was rougher again before the arrival off Fremantle early in the morning of Wednesday the 27th of February. They were taken up the harbour by tugs and with the assistance of a pilot. It was wonderful getting to a place where one could dress in comfort. It was beautifully cool, and for the first time since we left Cape Town, I really felt hungry for breakfast. Alongside the wharf was an absolute seething mass of people, but somehow they were kept at bay until 2 p.m. Ken went on a run up to Perth with Benson and Gladstone on their bikes on the worst road Ken had ever seen, through dry and uninteresting country which hadn't had a drop of rain since August. The run to Perth had damaged the bikes in some way, and while the bikes were being repaired, they watched the only cricket match that the squadron had won so far on the cruise. Thursday, the 28th of February, was not a happy day. After 10 holes of golf before breakfast, the only time when Western Australia is worth living in, there followed the ceremonial march through Perth on a really hot day, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, marching to and from the station with a perfectly ghastly half-hour train journey and a very badly organised lunch for 1,400 hot and tired men. Returning on board at about 4:15 p.m, they found that they had to fight their way through a crowd, about 20,000 strong, all trying to get on board over 2 gangways. Ken remarked, "I hope never to meet a Western Australian again. I prefer 10,000 niggers on board to 100 Australians, and I sincerely hope we don't go alongside at any more Australian ports." Given that one purpose of the cruise was to show the flag, Ken's attitude to the locals was pretty grudging, not to say blatantly racist, unacceptable today, but perhaps typical of those imperial times. Next day found Ken handing out tea at the ships at home between watches. He didn't much enjoy it, but supposed it was the penalty one had to pay for the cruise. He also had the middle watch, and was surprised that, considering the number of drunk seamen about, hardly any of the Hoods were the slightest bit the worse for wear. In fact, the majority of our Liberty men might have been coming off at Devonport. These things are relative, but we assume the crew were hand-picked for the flagship. The squadron sailed from Fremantle on the morning of Saturday the 1st of March. Thousands of people saw them off, special boats and trains being run from Perth starting at 4 a.m. Ken wasn't sorry to leave, but somewhat regretted his first impressions of Western Australia. Perhaps it was habitable after all. In the afternoon they went close into the coast and stopped off at Bunbury for the inhabitants to have a look at them. On the 2nd of March they arrived off Albany, anchoring outside about 3 miles from the pier. Albany is about 300 nautical miles from Fremantle, on the southernmost tip of Western Australia. Hence the weather was much cooler, and the squadron had gone back into blues. In the tropics the uniforms were whites. Ken anticipated that their stay there was going to be rather pleasant, and at any rate peaceful after Fremantle. They were the typical mixture of sport, entertainment and duty. The naval sports saw Ken fall at the sand jump in the middle of the officers' 100-yard race, and Benson get stuck in a barrel in the obstacle race, while the tennis, played on asphalt courts, saw the balls black and invisible after about 2 minutes. The ball was more successful, the 3-mile trip allowing a very noisy sing-song in the boat going ashore, though Ken had never heard a worse band. However, we behaved atrociously and thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. Another day of tennis and dancing and a late night, 4:20 a.m, was followed by a day in which Ken was incapable of hitting a ball. Not surprisingly, he was too tired to go to another dance that evening. One wonders what form the atrocious behaviour took. On the 6th of March, Ken had the forenoon watch. It really felt quite strange to keep a watch again after such a long rest. The battle cruisers were to have sailed in the morning, but were delayed by a WT message, telling them of the sudden death of Lady Brand, the wife of Rear Admiral Sir Hubert Brand, who commanded the light cruiser squadron. The exercises were put off. It poured with rain and the weather got quite thick. The whole squadron eventually sailed at 1:20 p.m. Across the great Australian bight there was a very long swell, which was affecting them more than any sea they had been in so far. The ship was rolling quite a lot, the maximum being 17 degrees to port and 14 degrees to starboard, and the small arms exercises planned had to be put off. Over the next 2 days the weather got much colder and remained quite rough, though nothing to what it sometimes is in the bight. Hood arrived off Adelaide at 7 a.m. on the 10th of March and anchored about 6 miles from the shore. The weather was perfectly glorious, like a very nice day in July in England. Ken saw one advantage to being such a long way offshore. I don't suppose we should be overrun with ship's visitors. Next day there was a ceremonial route march through Adelaide. It was the best march they had had so far, Ken thought, and the crowds were certainly larger than they had been before. After a most excellent lunch, Hood and Repulse shifted billet to Glenelg, where they lay only 2.5 miles off the pier. Glenelg is much closer to Adelaide than the outer harbour Port Adelaide. Ken was to have gone to a dance in the evening, but having got up at 3 a.m. and marched all day, he was far too tired and went to bed instead. The next 3 days were the usual mixture of sport, parties and late nights and duties on board. Wednesday was a tour of Adelaide, a glorious city, by far the nicest place we visited so far, I think. And in the evening the Lord Mayor's ball at the town hall, followed by dancing at the home of the hostess until 3 a.m. On Thursday Ken was on duty in the forenoon, but Hood had there at home in the afternoon, and Ken really enjoyed it for a change. The aversion from crowds and parties is evident throughout his career, but at least the teaching of dancing at Osborne and Dartmouth was coming in useful. On their final day in Adelaide, Ken was much more in his element, a drive in the hills revealing a beautiful view of Adelaide and the surrounding country. A cricket match for the squadron against South Australia, Ken scored 3, was followed by 2 dances, missing the last boat and having to doss down in the South Australian club until 6:30 a.m. On Saturday, the 15th of March, they sailed from Adelaide with much regret and anchored off Port Victoria for 6 hours to show the flag. Next afternoon, they went in close to Port Macdonnell, but didn't anchor. We are slowly recovering from Adelaide. Hood arrived in Melbourne on Monday, the 17th of March, passing through the Heads at 6:30 a.m, accompanied by hosts of small boats, etc., and also by aeroplanes. It's a fine bay, about 40 miles across, and we went round the coast to show ourselves to the various small towns near. Port Phillip Bay, or the Bay, as in the Seekers' song Mornington Ride, is said to cover an area of 750 square miles. The Heads are not much more than a mile across, between Port Lonsdale and Port Nepean. This opening is known as the Rip, which presumably aptly describes the flow of tidal water through the gap. It suggests a much larger version of the outflow from Chichester Harbour, where the tides have scoured a deep, narrow channel between Hayling Island and the sandbanks off East Head. Secured alongside at 11:15 a.m, the usual official calls followed, then a spin ashore to see the city in McWilliam's car, one of the lieutenant commanders. A cheerful dinner at the Menzies Hotel and a rather dull and frightfully crowded charity ball kept them ashore until nearly 4 a.m. The next day followed a standard theme of ceremonial march through Melbourne, with H.E., the governor taking the salute. When we returned to the ship it was almost impossible to get on board owing to the terrific crowd. There must have been hundreds of thousands on the pier. We got 26,000 on board during the afternoon, and it was only a small percentage of them. In the evening they dined on board and went in force to the Governor of Victoria and Lady Stradbroke's ball at the Wattle Club Palais, a magnificent building only just completed. The 2,500 guests fitted in quite easily, besides which the floor was lovely and the band better. There was a most amusing beginning to the dance, all the highbrows starting off with an official lancers, the governors, admirals, etc., and their staffs and families, and also Dame Nellie Melba, who was in great form. The dance was a huge success, and I was very sorry when we stopped soon after 3 a.m. I came back in the last bus, which took over an hour, returning on board at 4:30 a.m. The next few days alternated between duty and pleasure, during which Ken missed a couple of dances, but made up for them on Thursday the 20th of March with a cheerful lunch party with Gladstone, Craven, and 3 girls in the Chief of Staff's cabin, followed by dinner at the Menzies Hotel again, a cabaret and a private dance, getting back to bed around 4:15 a.m. Quite early. I shall be a wreck by the time we leave Melbourne. On Friday there was tennis, with Usher and others, in which the girls were far better than the men. This was followed by dinner and a dance at the State Government House. An excellent time, but I was really too tired to enjoy dancing. We dined at small tables in the veranda, Muriel and I being at the governor's table. Muriel, whose surname is not mentioned, seems to be a constant presence. Ken was amused that the governor addressed him as Boffy, Biff and Boff being the names Gerald Gladstone and Ken had adopted in the comedy act they had performed on board. A cutting from the Daily Telegraph, Sydney, date unknown, describes the performance of the 3 musketeers, Biff, Boff and Pip, evidently a long-standing turn. Another day of duty and another missed dance took Ken to Sunday the 23rd of March and, with Usher and others, taken by Muriel to a perfectly splendid weekend party at the Government Cottage, Mayston, about 45 miles from Melbourne, and a magnificent spot. They played a little tennis and thoroughly enjoyed themselves, getting the girls back to Melbourne about 7:45 p.m, having supper at Muriel's house. On Monday, the squadron played hockey against Victoria, winning 5-0. An enclosed newspaper cutting reported that Atkinson scored 1 goal and was conspicuous from the start. However, Ken was a bit scathing about the number of errors in the report. He underlined 10, including the description of himself as an All-England man for the last 2 seasons. He had only been a trialist, as described earlier. Another very cheerful little dinner party at Menzies was followed by Little Nellie Kelly, a poor show. Then back to Muriel's home, where they had supper and consoled one another over their coming departure until about 2 a.m. This visit to Melbourne was clearly an emotional one, and the unknown Muriel seems to have been central to the emotion. Was she a relative of the Stradbrokes, or did she work in the governor's office? At sea next day, bound for Hobart, Ken wrote, "It was a sad parting. I thought it would take a lot to beat Adelaide, but it wasn't in the same street as Melbourne. I think the last week has been one of the best of my life." The squadron left Melbourne at 6:30 a.m. and anchored in the bay, waiting for the light cruisers. At 10:30 a.m. they weighed anchor again and did steaming trials, not passing through the heads until 6 p.m. Half of the bay is shallower than 26 foot. Since Hood's mean draft was 28.5 feet, the steaming trials must have paid close attention to the navigation and the tide tables. The short passage to Tasmania took some 36 hours, but Ken had the middle watch on Tuesday night and complained that he was still unable to catch up for all his lost sleep. On Wednesday, the 26th of March, a memorial service was held for Mr. Puncheon, commissioned boatswain, who had died in Melbourne after a long illness on board. The visit to Hobart, Tasmania, lasted about a week and gave Ken a very English feel, quite pleasant but dominated by the continuous drizzling rain. Typical Davenport weather. Ken didn't enjoy the one private dance, and the ship had only had about 6,000 visitors on board for its open day, not a very strenuous day for him as duty officer. The Bishop of Tasmania preached to the ship's company on Sunday morning. A wonderful sermon. Monday saw the squadron at home aboard Hood, with Ken on duty again with the mildly ironic comment, "I'm glad the sequence hasn't been entirely broken." Tennis and rain, tea parties and the government house ball completed the visit to Tasmania. Hood left in the forenoon of Thursday, the 3rd of September, with one of the best send-offs we've had so far. Early next morning, signals started coming through from a Japanese ship, the Honolulu Maru, asking for assistance. She was about 100 miles to the northeast, in the centre of a revolving storm, with her cargo unmanageable and a list of 40 degrees. 2 of the light cruisers were sent to assist, but could be of no help except to stand by her. Hood arrived off Eden at about 3:30 p.m. and anchored in Twofold Bay until 8 p.m. so that the inhabitants could have a look at them. However, it was quite rough, and they only got about half a dozen visitors on board. Eden is a small town of no apparent distinction on the east coast of the New South Wales, about 150 nautical miles south of Jervis Bay. Perhaps the pause of 4.5 hours off Eden was to ensure arriving at Jervis Bay at the reasonable hour of 9:15 a.m. Arrived, Hood anchored off the college HMAS Cresswell, the RAN equivalent of Dartmouth, in perfectly vile weather, blowing a gale and raining a good deal. In the evening there was an at-home on board Hood for the officers of the squadron, before they dined at the Delhi's wardroom, including Captain Fairbairn. We received them with full guard and band, and OOW's staff of officers, also a 21-gun salute with Cotson guns. The guests were wheeled away in ammunition barrows by a howling mob. The whole evening was a great success, although perhaps rather a Jeeves benefit. Dragon arrived in during the evening with the Honolulu Maru in company. She must have had a rotten time. The HM and is lying in the bay now, still with a list of about 20 degrees and rolling horribly in the slight swell. Sunday was quite a peaceful day, with only about 1,000 guests on board, followed by a hockey match against Repulse on the college quarterdeck, and a squadron concert on board for the officers, cadets, ship's company, and families of the college, the best so far in Ken's view. The ship left Jervis Bay at 5 p.m. and made its way slowly to Sydney, doing 80 miles in 17 hours at 9 knots, which suggests plenty of slack in their timing, or perhaps an effort to save fuel. Hood passed through the Sydney Heads at the sensible hour of 10 a.m., to the magnificent sight of our arbour, in beautiful weather, with the whole harbour almost a solid mass of boats, large and small, making a ghastly din on their sirens. They moored, and Ken kept what ought to have been one of the most hectic forenoon watches of his life, but really there was so much to do that his only possible course was to pursue a policy of masterly inactivity. The next few days saw the usual hectic round of sport and social activity. Hood's at home on the 10th was completely ruined by a deluge of rain that poured through the awning and soaked everyone and everything, including the food. This was followed by a ball in the town hall, but they had been invited for a time an hour after the dance really started, and in consequence all the Sydney girls were booked up with civilians, and we all danced with the seagulls. After this bad start, things did look up. On Friday the 11th, Hood called on the Australian cruiser Melbourne in the forenoon, and found them an extraordinarily good crowd. In the afternoon, the squadron hockey team played an excellent game, even though, as Ken wrote, the squadron did win 8-1. An extract from the Daily Telegraph, Sydney, reveals that of the squadron 11, HMS Repulse contributed 5 players and 4 of the goals, while Ken was one of only 2 players from HMS Hood and scored a goal. The game was played at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and the paper reported the fleet's easy win thus: "The visitors displayed wonderful combination, and most of their goals were scored after splendid rushes by the vanguard. The Australians lacked in condition, and their defence was far too weak for the splendidly combined English rushes." On Saturday, the 12th of April, HMAS Australia was escorted out by the Australian fleet and sunk outside, so sadly ending the life of what had been a very fine ship. The Australia was a battle cruiser launched in 1911, and the only capital ship ever to be part of the Australian Navy. She had been important in the early part of the World War I in protecting the Dominion from Admiral Graf Spee's German East Asia Squadron, which was largely destroyed by 2 British ships of the same class as Australia at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. Next day, Sunday, Hood entertained the local hockey team that they had beaten so easily 2 days before. In the evening, Ken went ashore with Craven, and after supper they were driven around the harbour, seeing the sights by moonlight. Ken found it very pretty, but got tired of being expected to admire everything, of which the Australians were evidently so proud. However, he quickly changed his opinion of Sydney, noting that he always loathed the first 2 days at every place they went to, and wished they could go back again to the last one, but usually he thought better of it afterwards. "Although I'd still give almost anything to get back to Melbourne, I'm sure I shall enjoy the rest of our stay here, and I don't think we shall lack excitement. It promised to be almost as hectic as Melbourne, and already I'm feeling much better through lack of sleep." The ship was in Sydney for another week, with the customary hectic social life, official and private, Lord Mayor's dance, ship's company at home, Royal Australian Navy dance with excellent floors, and the inevitable late nights back on board. The tennis seems to have taken second place to dancing, and generally seems to have been voted terrible, despite the excellent courts. The public dance floors were also rated very good, though frightfully crowded. On Thursday, the 17th of April, Lady Stradbroke appears again as hostess of a dinner dance. Why she showed up again is a bit of a mystery, as her husband was Governor of Victoria and Sydney is in New South Wales. No mention of Muriel, though. On Good Friday, Ken was on duty and feeling more sleepy than he could remember, having had a succession of 8 nights at dances, on only one of which did he get to bed before 2 a.m. Luckily, it was a peaceful day, although the ship was completely overrun by visitors in the afternoon. Ken again shows his attitude to visitors while evidently enjoying the time as a visitor himself. The 19th of April was a quieter day, though he did include some more tennis. At 7 a.m. on Easter Sunday, after a terrific thunderstorm in the small hours, the like of which Ken had never seen in his life and hoped never to see again, the battle cruisers, in company with the new light cruiser HMAS Adelaide, which joined them for the rest of the cruise homeward, left Sydney and Australia. Ken was very sorry to leave Australia behind, surmising nearly everyone had come away with a broken heart, also more or less wrecks. The squadron was at sea for 4 days, at an average speed of 12 knots, and the weather was rough most of the time. A certain amount of minor damage was suffered one afternoon, when a sea came right over the port battery awning, solid green, and it poured in through an open scuttle in the wardroom. The field gun was knocked over, and the collision mat and fire engine unshipped. Also, all of the cars aft were soaked. They arrived in Wellington on Thursday the 24th of April, to the usual calls to and from dignitaries, with Ken on duty. His Excellency Lord Jellicoe, former Admiral of the Fleet and then Governor-General of New Zealand, was among the callers with local councillors and the Harbour Board members. Hood remained at Wellington until Saturday the 10th of May with a now familiar round of ceremonial, official and private dances and sport, though somewhat quieter than in Australia. Friday the 25th of April was Anzac Day, and Ken marched with some of the troops to the cenotaph, where the admirals, Jellicoe and Field, both gave addresses. Another ceremonial march a few days later, and also the ships at home were accompanied by strong winds and some rain, and, this being winter, there was no tennis, but some golf and hockey. There was a trip to the races at Trenton, about 20 miles out of Wellington, with Duncan Beauchamp, who had been the engineer officer at Osborne in Ken's time, and was now manager of the Leyland Works in New Zealand. Ken won the colossal sum of 5 shillings and 3 pence, say around 26p in modern currency, not a sum to be sneered at in those days. The Navy League ball at the Town Hall was quite good fun, but somewhat dull after Sydney. On the other hand, there weren't so many visitors to the ship, only about 8,000 that day, and Ken found them to be extraordinarily nice people, entirely different to the Australian crowd. Two particular features of this part of the cruise were Biff's motorbike and gramophone, and the reappearance of Ken's mother and sister Violet. On Tuesday, the 6th of May, Ken and Biff set off by train for Auckland accompanied by motorbike and gramophone, the ship remaining in Wellington. The former seems to have got lost on the journey, but the latter provided them with quite an amusing journey in their 4-berth sleeper cabin. No food was provided on the train, but it stopped at Martin at about 5 p.m, when everyone made a rush for the refreshment room, where high tea was provided. Ken found the New Zealand Grand Trunk a most peculiar method of travelling. It was dark most of the way, so they didn't see any of the wonderful scenery, but it was certainly extremely cold up the mountains. The railway at one place reaches a height of 2,000 feet. In Auckland they stayed at the Grand Hotel, supposedly the finest hotel in Australasia, and one which Ken found to be a most excellent place, especially fortunate in possessing such a fine person as Mrs. Hatfield, with whom we both fell in love. Next day, Thursday, the 8th of May, Ken's mother and Violet arrived from Matakana, where Constance's brother Ernest, born 1874, so 2 years younger than Con, was farming. Matakana is near the town of Warkworth, on the east coast, north of Auckland, a pair of place names from north-east England. The family was staying within a stone's throw of the Grand. On the Friday the bike arrived, and was soon in action with a trip to Roomera. On Saturday, the last day of our gentlemanly lives at £20,000 a year, we took the family out in a launch to see the boats come in, and we had most excellent fun seeing the ships as others see us. Of course, we took the gramophone with us. It poured with rain a good deal of the time, but that didn't matter much. In the afternoon the whole family came on board, and we had a large tea party in the England captain's cabin. In the evening we all dined at the Grand, and we went on to Dixieland afterwards. It should have been a wonderful evening, but somehow just failed. At the end we were all rather dejected. The ship was in Auckland for another week, and Ken fitted social occasions with his family, on board and ashore, between other duties, with help from his friends. On Sunday his mother and sister came on board to church in the morning, but the crowd was too much for them in the afternoon, so Craven and Ken went ashore after tea to look them up. Monday saw the ships at home. Quite a success, and Tuesday the ceremonial route march in the forenoon, quite a short one this time, I'm glad to say, and the weather held so it wasn't so bad as usual. The crowds were very dense, but as at Wellington there was very little cheering, very different from the Australians. Edwards very kindly went ashore and took charge of Mother and Violet. He took them up to Government House in the Admiral's Rolls, and got them the best view of any from the roof, where they saw the march past the Governor. In the afternoon the family, with just in and just out, after a very wet trip in the CMB, came on board and we had a very cheery tea party, assisted by the ever-present gramophone. Next day, a large luncheon party, about a dozen in the Chief of Staff's room, including the Atkinson family, was a great success, as was a terrific dinner party at the Grand for much of the same group, plus about 15 more. Afterwards, the Government House ball was not so enjoyable, but overcrowded, and Delhi's band in a separate room played continuously. We got back on board at about 1:45, and Biff and I went ashore and fancy dress for about an hour, but didn't do very much. Evidently the spirit of the Australian part of the cruise was beginning to return, but it was not to last. On Thursday, the 15th of May, Ken was on duty and feeling pretty mouldy. He missed an excellent powder and patch ball in the evening. Next morning he was feeling even worse, but went ashore to see the family and to try and shake off his flu. In the afternoon we played a hockey match against Auckland. It poured with rain all day and the ground was very sticky, but we had an excellent game. Before we got going they scored 4 goals, but afterwards we improved and it was 4-3 at the end. The first time the squadron has been beaten. Not surprisingly, he was feeling even worse when he got back and went to bed at 6 p.m, so missing what ought to have been the best dance of all at the Bloomfields. It was very unfortunate, because Violet wouldn't go if I didn't, so it rather spoiled her last day with us. Biff seems to have fallen at last to Justin, however, we're only young once. Saturday the 17th of May was Hood's last day in Auckland. Perfectly ghastly, blowing hard and pouring with rain, almost like Wellington, only not quite so cold, and Ken was still feeling pretty mouldy. Sailing was postponed from 4 p.m. to 6 a.m. on Monday. Ken's mother and Violet came on board at about 10:30 a.m. and stayed for lunch, and Ken went to bed early. On the Sunday, the weather was vastly improved. In fact, by the evening it was perfectly beautiful again, and now it's getting much warmer. I have taken over as N, Assistant Navigator, from Craven, and now have plenty of work to do for a change, at sea and in the harbour. 2 days later, the squadron passed into Zone 12, and Ken noted that we cannot get any further from home. Although at times this cruise has been absolutely splendid, I shan't be at all sorry when we sight Devonport once more. The weather was getting hotter and hotter, and Ken had come to the conclusion that he really quite liked the heat, and was feeling far better than he had done for the past few months. But of course that may be on account of doing a little work for a change. On Wednesday, the 21st of May, they arrived in Suva Harbour. It was most interesting coming in through a very small gap in the coral reef, although I'm not really greatly impressed by the first sight of the South Sea Islands one hears so much about. They seem quite ordinary, although certainly very pleasant as far as I can make out. I finished my first passage as Assistant N without, as far as I know, having made a complete fool of myself. Ken's other duties included being in charge of B turrets during gunnery trials, and he was dreading the Admiral's inspection. The inevitable dancing at the Grand Palace Hotel followed, far inferior even to New Zealand, however I thoroughly enjoyed it. Native dances were wonderfully interesting to watch, but a bit trying after 2.5 hours. Hood's at Home was one of the best of the cruise, beautiful weather and not so crowded as usual. Dinner aboard Delhi was great fun. It was beautifully cool dining in their quarterdeck, and afterwards we had the usual dancing, singing, fighting, etc. An excellent evening which ended at about midnight. We all paddled over in a gig, attired in shorts and tennis shirts, and we were met by a Maori troop of Delhi's officers who greeted us with a war dance. On another day, Repulse's officers had been fishing for sharks and caught a 7-foot one, and another night an 11-foot one. Ken remarked that he didn't think he would bathe there very much. Saturday, the 24th of May, was Empire Day, marked by the usual route march, followed by a hockey match against Suva, which was a fiasco from beginning to end due to partisan refereeing. Presumably they lost. Next day, Sunday, the Bishop of Polynesia preached in the forenoon. In the afternoon there was a tennis match against the light cruisers, in which Hood got badly beaten. The courts are grass, but very coarse grass, and in consequence very slow and take a lot of getting used to. Monday, the 26th of May, was the last day in Suva, and Ken was supposed to be playing cricket for the squadron, but it poured with rain all day and cricket was out of the question. The farewell dance in the evening was thoroughly enjoyable, but it was frightfully hot and sticky. We got back to the ship about 03:15, feeling in excellent form. On Tuesday, the 27th of May, Hood left Suva in perfectly beastly weather, very hot and raining most of the time. Ken not feeling in quite such excellent form, but not really sorry to leave Suva, though he found it the best tropical place they had been to except Kuala Lumpur, but after Australasia rather flat in most ways. There are more than 300 islands and many islets in the Fiji archipelago, of which more than 100 are inhabited. The squadron passed close to Levka, an island to the east of the main island and northeast of Suva, in the afternoon, and then round Ngau in the night, so as to arrive off Taveuni early in the morning and pass through the Nanuka Straits in daylight. It is difficult to follow this tour of the Fijian islands in the absence of detailed charts. Taveuni is to the east of the group, northeast of Suva. On Tuesday, the 27th of May, the squadron crossed the 180th meridian, the international date line, at 5 a.m., turning back their clocks by 24 hours, so that the next day was still Tuesday the 27th of May, the 357th day of their year. Ken hoped that they would get an extra day's pay. On Thursday, the 29th of May, the squadron arrived off Samoa early in the morning and stopped off at Apia, the capital, so that the inhabitants could have a look at them. The natives came off in their war canoes, very long boats with about 40 paddles in each, and as they went round and round the ship they chanted a native dance. The administrator of Samoa came on board, and the usual 15-gun salute was fired when he left. Later they steamed along the north coast of the two islands that make up Samoa, in those days a New Zealand Trust territory, but now an independent nation. There are 5 smaller islands to the east of Samoa, which were then, and are still, an unorganized territory of the USA. These the squadron did not visit, though when they reached the western point of Samoa they set course for Honolulu. Ken commented, "Samoa looked quite an uninteresting place, very hot, and chiefly noticeable to us is that it is charted very badly." I wonder whether the poor charting was a consequence of it never having been part of the British Empire, and so never charted by the Admiralty. The first day of this leg of the cruise also started badly, perhaps partly because of the poor charts. The weather was beastly hot and sticky, and none of Ken's sights came out properly. He tried to go to bed early, but was kept awake by that ghastly institution, the Choral Society, and by various officers tripping over him on the quarterdeck. Eventually, after 2 hours' fruitless effort, it started to rain, and he fell down the hatch, bed and all, and then retired to his cabin, where, the fan being broken, he spent a miserable night in a temperature of about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and was thankful to get up at 5 a.m. for the morning star sights, to fix their longitude after a night of dead reckoning. The next week, as the squadron travelled steadily northwards, was largely uneventful. The distance is a little over 2,000 nautical miles, and it was covered in about 7.5 days, so an average speed of 12 to 13 knots. Although nothing of much interest happened, Ken found plenty to do in the navigation department to keep him busy, but was beginning to wish the sun didn't rise so infernally early, though he preferred this to routine work. On Sunday, the 1st of June, they crossed the equator for the fourth and last time of the cruise. Ken's mess bill for the previous month had exceeded his pay by £3, and he failed to draw a horse in the daily sweep on the 3rd of June, which cost him another £1. I don't know what Ken's pay was at this time, but I don't imagine it was much different from the 13 shillings and sixpence, equivalent to 67.5 pence in today's currency, each day, which as a newly promoted lieutenant would have been paid in 1942. That would amount to £4 and 15 shillings per week to Ken, or just over £20 per calendar month. A mess bill of £3 over his pay would indeed suggest a good time had been had by all. His pay of around £250 per year can be compared with the UK annual average wage in 1924 of £157. The peaceful journey continued northwards. The weather was getting cooler, but there were never any clouds to cover up the stars and sun, an important consideration for a navigator in those days before satellite navigation or long-range radio positioning, when every position had to be determined by dead reckoning, the chronometer and sun and star sights with a sextant. Hawaii was sighted very early on the morning of Friday the 6th of June. After earlier independence, Hawaii was annexed by the USA as a federal territory in the late 1890s, that being its status in 1924. It became a State of the Union in 1959. Although, or perhaps because it was a US territory, the welcome was exuberant. They had lighted beacons all along the coast, which by many were mistaken for volcanoes, and also to welcome us they had 30 airplanes out at dawn, which flew round and around us. All the ships were, unusually, berthed alongside, and Ken described Honolulu as a glorious place and not nearly as hot as they had expected. Despite having been on the bridge from 2:45 a.m, he had to go on patrol and spent from 4:30 p.m. to midnight wandering around the town with the officer of the US Navy Patrol, a Lieutenant J.G. Pixton, whom he found very interesting. Although this was the era of prohibition in the USA, and Hawaii was officially dry, there was a lot of very bad drink about, known as Okelehoa, corrected to Okolehao, and a Hawaiian moonshine distilled from the root of the tea plant. And there was also opium dens and various other undesirable places in the low part of the city, the Mosquito Flats, where there are also dangerous gangs of Hawaiians and Japs, so that besides the naval patrol, there is a military patrol of 60 in that district. I went all round them with Pixton, but didn't see anything, although one soldier was murdered and robbed. Our men appeared to keep off the oke all right, and I only saw one American sailor flaked out. They have a submarine base here with 20 boats and a small depot at Pearl Harbor, but nothing much else. There are also 10,000 American troops here. As with the Singapore Naval Base visited earlier, Pearl Harbor was to see massive development in the next 18 years, until becoming the target of the attack by the Japanese, which brought the USA into World War II in December 1941. This visit to US territory was different in many ways from the imperial and colonial visits. There was officially no alcohol during that period of prohibition in the United States, and their Saturday evening dinner ashore with Usher, Moore, and Edwards was most peculiar, with apple dumplings as an entree amongst other funny customs. Before dinner we bathed on the Waikiki beach, and after dinner we sat there in the moonlight and saw the Southern Cross on one hand and the Pole Star on the other. They then went on to a hotel and watched the dancing. They couldn't take part because they were still in flannels from earlier tennis. On this visit, the emphasis was less on socialising and more on sightseeing, as in Ken's diary entry from Sunday, the 8th of June. "This island is really the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Far and away the nicest place we've been to so far. I'd love to stop here for years. There's a large range of mountains across the island, and only one possible means of getting across for man or beast, and the view from up there is simply magnificent. No photo can show it, because I suppose the colouring is the best part." Colour photography was still experimental at this time, before the advent of Kodachrome and Agfa processes in the mid-1930s. "I think this is the only place on this cruise that I haven't been slightly disappointed from the descriptions beforehand, and the climate, although somewhat relaxing, is simply glorious, not too hot because the trade winds blow nearly all the time. We stayed over at Kailua until after dark, and now I know what it's like when it's moonlight in Kailua. We returned on board about 11:30 p.m. On Monday, a drive to Kualoa confirmed Ken's view of the glorious country, and he met some extraordinarily interesting people of all nations, including Professor Rock, who has just come back from an expedition in Tibet for the American government. The next 3 days saw some dancing, which was enjoyable, though Ken didn't think the climate really suitable for dancing. Ken and Usher were in good form despite being dry. On one occasion a party of them went out to Waikiki and bathed, and then had more dancing at the Mona Hotel. Between the dances everyone trooped out onto the Waikiki beach, which was perfectly marvellous with the surf and very nearly a full moon. We finished about 12:15 and went on to a Chinese restaurant in the town and had some supper, and eventually returned on board at about 2:30 in the morning. There doesn't seem to have been the same degree of ceremonial in the American territory as there'd been in the British colonies and dominions, which may have added to the holiday spirit, though Ken doesn't mention that. Next morning, Thursday the 12th of June, Hood slipped. I slipped her mooring cables, all the ships having been alongside in Honolulu, and sailed for Canada. Ken's summing up of the visit to Hawaii was, "I've never been much sorrier to leave a place. It sure was wonderful. I can easily sympathise with the many people who have come out here for a 3-week holiday and stopped for the rest of their lives. I should like to have stopped myself. We had a wonderful send-off, thousands of people on the jetty, and we were all covered in garlands and Hawaiian emblems from the Admiral down, and we gave 3 cheers for Honolulu." The next 9 days were spent at sea, heading for Victoria, British Columbia. The passage included the dreaded inspection by the Admiral, which required Ken to stand by his gun turret. In the event, the Admiral only went into the shell room and magazine of B turret and the gun houses of A and Y. Ken described as a blessing, though he quaked in his shoes for about 3 hours. Ken missed the rest of the inspection as he took over as officer of the watch. The weather was getting quite cold, heading northeast as they were from Hawaii just inside the Tropic of Cancer at about 21 degrees north, to Victoria at about 49 degrees north. The squadron had gone into half whites, none too soon. Following the inspection, there was evidently a battle exercise lasting all night and until noon the next day, with a few mishaps, including 2 delays in Ken's turret, one of which could have been serious. Only Y turret, the unreliable of the 4, fired without mishap. At the beginning of World War I, the Navy's gunnery was notoriously unreliable, and evidently 10 years later there were still problems with the guns and ammunition. There were, however, no accidents, unlike one which Ken noted earlier in the USS Mississippi, who had a very bad accident with a hang fire in one of her turrets, killing 3 officers and 46 men. The weather is getting steadily colder and also foggy, much colder than it ever is in England in the summer, Ken surmised. On the 21st of June, early in the morning, they passed through the Juan de Fuca Straits, dividing Canadian from US waters, picked up a pilot and a terrific mail, and Hood, Repulse and Adelaide went alongside at Victoria at midday. The light cruisers anchored, at Esquimalt, a naval base just to the west of and very close to Victoria, British Columbia. 3 days in Victoria saw much sightseeing in the vicinity. Malahat, Maple Bay, north of Duncan and about 50 miles from Victoria. Lake Shawnigan, for a most amusing weekend party at a bungalow by the lake, and we made merry till about midnight. It really is the most glorious spot, rather like Norway in every way, only the water is warm enough to bathe in. At least they said so. Ken didn't try himself. From Malahat Park, Ken wrote of, the most magnificent view from the house that I've ever seen. You could see for miles, and immediately below us was the fjord and pine forests everywhere in a dense mass. The usual round of balls and dances, motor drives and late nights was only interrupted by a ceremonial march back on British territory in Canada. One of the best we've done. The weather was ideal and the people were most enthusiastic. On Tuesday, the 24th of June, Ken and Barnes entertained 2 girls to tea in the engineer captain's cabin, and afterwards they went to a dance at the Empress Hotel, which was perfectly splendid, almost up to Melbourne standards. The band was perfectly glorious. It's a change to hear some really new tunes. Why Did I Kiss That Gal? And I Ain't Gonna Rain No More will always remind me of Victoria, just as various others remind me of other places and incidents. He got back on board that morning at about 3:40 a.m. On Wednesday, the 25th of June, the ship left Victoria at 7 a.m., much to their disgust, and steamed up to Vancouver, a distance of about 90 miles in mist and drizzle. They got a wonderful reception at Vancouver, which seemed rather like a small edition of what Ken imagined New York would look like, though he was too tired to appreciate it and fell fast asleep on his bunk about 4:20 p.m., having got in at 2:30 p.m. The next 2 days saw the usual formalities, but everyone seemed to be getting rather tired. An empty ballroom for the mayor's reception and ball was only enlivened by Gladstone's performance on the piano of his only piece, The Dead March. What must be rated as easily the worst show of the cruise. The ship's At Home was a very difficult affair, as no one knew anyone else, though it went off all right, Ken thought. After that things improved, with a delightful dinner party, followed by a splendid show. Afterwards they went on to the Belle Ewing dance, and Ken was exceedingly sorry when it was all over soon after 3 a.m. He got on board in broad daylight just before 4 a.m., feeling in fine form. His verdict was that Vancouver improved on acquaintance and promised to be almost as hectic as Sydney. A good night's rest was followed by 2 whole days of shore patrol, which doesn't seem to have involved much patrolling. Saturday was peaceful, and Ken spent it mostly in the Vancouver club, eating and writing letters. Sunday was even quieter, and he met the most amazing man at the club, Matheson, son of the Primate of Canada, who talked without stopping for 6 hours, most amusing. Following another ceremonial march on Monday, the 30th of June, it was back to the socializing, tennis, a dinner party, a very hot and crowded dance, and a late night, getting back on board at about 4 a.m. Feeling full of luck. The climate here must be wonderful. I always feel my best at 4 a.m. Tuesday, the 1st of July, was Dominion Day, entirely taken up with entertaining ashore and afloat, dancing, eating, and even playing bridge. They also watched the firework display at Stanley Park and the ship's searchlight display. 2 days of patrol followed, with time on Wednesday only for dinner at the club and some bridge. Thursday was Violet's birthday, and Ken remembered to send off a cable, long before the days of mobile or international telephones. At 2000, I took my patrol down to the pier and looked after the embarkation of guests to our dance, and I had to stay down there till 23:45, when we managed to get the last Liberty men away. I got on board soon after midnight, only to find that Usher had pinched my gold-laced trousers. However, I managed to borrow Darcy's, and was just in time for the last 3 or 4 dances, which I had booked beforehand. After the dance was over, I took Edna ashore, and we went with a somewhat rowdy crowd to Love's, where we ate scrambled eggs. I got back to the pier at about 03:30, only to find no boats and the Belle Ewing's motor boat broken down. 2 or 3 others joined me in time, all repulses, and at about 0500 hours we discovered a customs dinghy unoccupied. This we borrowed and pulled ourselves off to the ships. The repulse, I hope, sent the skiff back. Friday, the 4th of July, was the last day in Vancouver, and was relatively quiet, with a pleasant afternoon spent in West Vancouver at the house of a man called Buck, who had apparently been at Ilkley. Presumably Ken meant at the grammar school. Dinner with some guests on board, and bridge against Vancouver's best couple, by whom they were decidedly beaten, completed a rather pleasant evening. They're awfully good fellows. On Saturday, the 5th of July, the squadron left for 2 days at sea, heading south for San Francisco. Ken's summary was that British Columbia had given them a reception which would be hard to beat anywhere, and the people, who had gone to Calgary and Egmont, had had just as good a time. They thought better. The weather on this passage was very cold, with a strong north wind and a rough sea, luckily a following one. They were in sight of land the whole way, thank goodness, no star sights. There was, of course, no satellite navigation, nor radar, and the position of the ship had to be fixed either by cross bearings or recognized land features, or by sun or star sights with a sextant, and by dead reckoning, known course and speed, and a knowledge of tidal flows. On Monday, the 7th of July, at about 2 p.m, the squadron was met by 2 American destroyers, who sent navigating officers on board Hood and Delhi, the 2 flagships, to give any assistance that might be required entering the harbour. Soon after 4 p.m, they passed through the Golden Gates in a haze. It had been foggy all day, as apparently it usually is here, but we could see about 5 miles. An aeroplane tried to drop the Golden Key on board, but just missed, which was rather a pity. They moored in the harbour at 5 p.m, the American ships present being California, Tennessee, Idaho, and Mississippi. It's a wonderful harbour, by far the best we've been to so far. From the point of shipping, there is miles and miles of wharfage. The 3 days in San Francisco seems to have been rather quiet, if not boring, compared with earlier visits. However, Ken found the Americans exceedingly charming, and they did everything in their power to entertain their guests. A banquet was a most wonderful feast, despite being limited to iced water. Hood's at home was quite a success, and Ken again met some sisters from Honolulu, an American fishing fleet. A tour of the city, on the other hand, was boring, partly, one suspects, because of the perpetual haze, though one afternoon Ken was taken for a drive into the surrounding country towards Santa Cruz and the Redwood country. It was surprising how, when about 10 miles south of San Francisco, we ran out of the fog bank, which is continually over San Francisco. The temperature rose about 15 degrees, and it was gloriously hot. I saw some of the fruit districts of California, and we also visited Mrs. Winchester's house, which she was building for the last 30 years of her life. It is the most extraordinary freak I've ever seen. Contains 160 rooms, all made of different woods, and with different kinds of architecture. 37 different kinds of fireplaces, 12 different kinds of kitchens, 17 bathrooms, 637 doors, and innumerable windows. Practically each room was a different level, although only a 2-storied house, and we walked over it with a guide for 45 minutes, moving quite fast the whole time, and only one room did we visit twice. This visit wasn't boring, neither was the previous evening, which, after dinner with some awfully nice Americans, they fell into a robbery at a garage on the way back. Typically American. However, to their disappointment, there was no shooting, and they caught the 2 a.m. boat quite peacefully. Hood unmoored at 5 a.m. on Friday, the 11th of July, and sailed at 6:30 a.m. Ken noted, "I'm glad I've been to San Francisco, and I certainly have found out that the American N.O. is an extraordinary good fellow, but I'm not sorry to leave all the same." At 4 p.m. the light cruisers parted company and left for South America. A pity, Ken thought, as they had got on very well together for 8 months, and it was a sorrowful parting. During the forenoon they passed about 2.5 cables from a Canadian bootlegger. Her decks were stacked with barrels of liquor, and she was unloading into a smaller boat about 20 miles off the coast. For the next 11 days, as the battle cruisers headed south, keeping 70 to 100 miles from the coast of California and Mexico, the weather got hotter again, and very little of interest happened. Guadalupe Island was avoided, and deck hockey was in full swing again, although it was really far too hot. Ken thought it about the hottest sea trip they had done. There's so very little wind. However, it was their last trip in the tropics, and it was possible to sleep on the quarterdeck quite peacefully. By Monday, the 21st of July, in order to get to Panama early on Wednesday, the ships were hurtling through the water at 13 knots, Adelaide belching forth black smoke in order to keep up. The passage through the Panama Canal is best told in Ken's own words. Wednesday, the 23rd of July. We arrived off Panama at 07:30 and anchored until 0900. Then we started up the canal. The first part wasn't very interesting, past Panama and Balboa. At the latter place the Adelaide lay coaling, also 2 American submarines and an Ecuadorian cruiser. The locking up we did between 11:30 and 13:30, and then secured alongside the wall at Pedro Miguel till the next morning, the repulse lying in the 3rd lock. It is done in 3 steps, but unlike the locking down, there is about a mile between the 2nd and 3rd locks, as there was not enough solid foundation for the 3 together. It's a very quick process. 4 mules, kind of tanks, each side take wires from your bow and stern and keep you in the middle as far as possible. Of course they work every day and are perfectly expert at it by now. The men in them acting immediately on every sign of the pilot. Each lock only takes about 7 minutes or thereabouts to fill, so there is very little waiting. We are the biggest ship that has ever been through the canal, and we had about 2 foot to spare on either side in the locks. Incidentally, it cost the Admiralty £5,000 to get us through the canal. As one might expect, this is a reasonably good estimate of the clearance, allowing for booms slung alongside and so on. Hood's beam is listed as 105 foot 2.5 inches, while the width of the locks at that time was 110 foot, giving a clearance of less than 3 foot on either side. The toll charge in 1928 would have been at the rate of $5 to £1 sterling, so perhaps $25,000. Today it would appear from the internet that the toll of a warship of 42,000 tons displacement, as the Hood was, to be in the region of $77,000, or about £58,000 at today's rate, September 2016, and at a great deal more later. Thursday, the 24th of July. We moved at 0600 and then came about the most interesting part of the canal, the Culebra Cut, which is only 500 feet broad, and at certain places has some bends which might have been very awkward for a ship of our length. But our pilot handled the ship magnificently, and we never looked like touching. After the cut, which is about 20 miles long, we got into broader waters, and eventually into the Gatun Lakes, which are fairly easy to navigate, and where we passed several ships. We reached the Gatun Locks about 10:30, and here we did all 3 steps straight after one another, a drop of 85 feet. It was most amusing, after we had gone through to look up and see the repulse in what appeared to be the middle of a green field. Actually, it takes longer going down than up because as soon as the lock gates are opened, the seawater rushes in and displaces the fresh, which rushes out on the surface at the rate of sometimes 10 knots, so that the ship had to be held for about 15 minutes before steaming out. We anchored outside the breakwater at Colon at about 12:45 and waited until 1400 when the Repulse and Adelaide came out, and we proceeded for Jamaica. Ken found the Atlantic wind refreshing after the Pacific, and several people got very wet on the quarterdeck, though it was still frightfully hot. The squadron arrived at Port Royal, Jamaica, on the morning of Saturday the 26th of July. It looks a very pretty place. In anticipation, the programme for the visit looked great fun, the usual receptions, dances, ceremonial march, and at home, and in the event the heat became almost tolerable. The ceremonial route march was very short, but they marched in a mass of blacks who ran round and round the ranks and between the companies, making it unnecessarily hot and unpleasant. The at-home was brought to rather an abrupt conclusion by a deluge of rain. After the 2 hottest, stickiest days of the cruise, Ken was very glad to leave their last tropical port on Thursday the 31st of July, making their way towards Halifax via the windward and crooked passages. At 9:30 p.m. they went on to 17 knots for a fuel consumption trial. On the 1st of August, life took on a lighter hue, with the prospect of being home in September and the distribution of the wine surplus. Meanwhile, the trials continued with a full power trial of 2 hours at full speed, developing, Ken thought, 150,000 horsepower. Janes lists the full speed as 32 knots and the power as 151 shaft horsepower. Ken's role was to operate the Dutchman's log, which appears to have been a primitive way of measuring the speed of the ship, in which Repulse, leading Hood, threw spars overboard, which Ken on A turret and Craven on the quarterdeck timed as they passed. Knowing the distance between the 2 observation points, the speed of the ship could be calculated. Hood then overtook Repulse and threw the spars for the latter's speed trial. The weather was beginning to get a little cooler, and continued to do so for the next 5 days, and on Tuesday, the 5th of August, it was really quite cold, and the ship's companies had gone back into blues. On the 4th of August, Ken was warmed up by a game of deck hockey, and then dined with the Admiral and had a ripping time. He really is most charming and makes you feel at home at once. Everyone seemed to be cheering up again with the cool, and we had the most uproarious set of lancers on the QD after dinner, the judge being the only one who really knew the steps. Ken was well placed to appreciate the Admiral, as he was sitting on the Admiral's left. Captain Thurn might be supposed to have been German, but he was the captain of the Hood, and Admiral Field's flag captain. Ken's diary continues. Tuesday, the 5th of August. Really quite cold today, and we've gone straight into blues. This really is a horrible coast. It was foggy all day, and I had to work the surrounding machines solidly from 4 a.m. until 12:40, when we eventually found the whistle buoy at the entrance to Halifax Harbour. We then anchored at about 13:20 and waited for it to clear, which it did at about 15:30, and we saw the land. However, as soon as we weighed in, it came down thicker than ever, and we couldn't even see the Repulse. But we knew where we were, and we went on, and when we did reach the channel, found that it was quite clear inside, as it had been all day. We eventually moored up the harbour at about 17:15, and then discovered that despite their signals, they were keeping summertime, and it was really 18:15. There was a dance in the evening at the Government House, but by this time I was absolutely dead tired and couldn't go. However, I got a really splendid mail, 11 letters which made up for everything. The ships were 10 days in Halifax, 10 days of mainly fog and boredom, absolutely nothing to do, everyone asleep and no interest taken in the ships. In the very rare intervals in the fog, there was usually a thunderstorm. For the first 5 days or so Ken stayed in bed with a ghastly cold and splitting headache. He missed the at-home, and would have missed his first route march of the cruise had it not been postponed due to the weather. On his feet again and back to duty on Sunday the 10th of August, he played some golf and attended the reception at Government House. He was on patrol in Halifax in the afternoon and evening of Wednesday, which seemed to be mainly letter writing at the Halifax Club, where the secretary kept some very good whisky, despite the country being dry. However, coming off patrol just after midnight, soaked to the skin, he was able to join a most amusing little dance on board, really one of the best of the cruise, and had an excellent evening. Agnew joined the ship from the Repulse on the 14th of August, and as he was a qualified N, Ken had perforce to return to watchkeeping. And as much as I hate work, I think I dislike watchkeeping in harbour even more. However, it's not for much longer, only 6 weeks more and home sweet home, or at any rate England. The ship sailed from Halifax the next day. Ken didn't enjoy being back in the fold, but the weather was glorious. Real English summer with quite a nip in the air. It was quite a pleasure playing deck hockey, not merely an agony. They entered the St. Lawrence River on Sunday morning in thick fog and had to anchor, arriving at Quebec exactly 24 hours late, on Tuesday afternoon the 19th of August. The next 2 days were dull, then finding it as dull a place as Halifax. Thursday was enlivened by a ceremonial march, Ken's 15th of the cruise, missing only Halifax of the total of 16. It was a success, but 2¼ miles, very hot, and the worst roads and filthiest places imaginable. However, he was starting to enjoy these marches, and would have been sorry if they didn't march through London, as it had been rumoured they might. On Friday, the 22nd of August, a party of 150 men and 18 officers embarked in Hms Constance for the 11-hour trip up to Montreal. A most pleasant trip, but not really beautiful country, rather flat and uninteresting. Ken was lucky enough to have been selected for the party going on to Toronto, so after dinner he caught the train, arriving at 7 a.m. on Saturday. He, Edwards and Neves were being hosted by a Mr. Tovall, who showed them around Toronto in his car before lunch at the exhibition grounds. Vice Admiral Field of the Royal Navy on Saturday afternoon set in motion the 46th Annual Canadian National Exhibition, with the biggest crowd ever experienced on opening day, and a few of the British seamen who put the German Navy in its place at Jutland and Scapa Flow. The German Navy was put in its place at the Battle of Jutland, if that means that they never thereafter dared to leave harbour for a major engagement, though the Royal Navy lost about twice as many men and more ships than the Germans. The mention of Scapa Flow presumably refers to the scuttling of the German fleet in 1919, which hardly gave credit to British seamen. Then those of us who were marching had to march round about 4½ miles, finishing up again in the grounds where Admiral Field took the salute. Our sailors, mostly cooks, writers, chief stokers, etc., most of whom had never marched before, headed by McWilliam and myself, must have looked rather funny at the head of 3,000 war veterans. After the march, Tovall introduced us to a lot of his friends, all charming people, and we went and watched motor racing and some auto polo, the most exciting game I think I've ever seen. Only one car aside, of course, and they turned over and over one another at times. We left the exhibition at about 17:30 and went back to our hotel to shift and have dinner. After dinner, we went out to the Thornhill Golf Club, where we had a perfectly splendid little dance. I've seldom enjoyed one so much. Everyone was so cheerful, and things went with a proper swing. We got home about 1 a.m. Sunday, the 24th of August. We got up very early, and with all the troops caught a train at 8:30 for Niagara Falls. It took us about 2½ hours to get out there, and we spent a glorious day looking around the falls, which really are magnificent, and I don't think at all disappointing. Most of our party went under the falls and through the powerhouses, but I'm afraid Neves and I were rather lazy and spent most of our time at the Clifton Hotel merely looking at them. At about 16:30 we all got into cars and went down to Niagara on the lake, where we spent a most amusing evening. Some of the party dined at the mess of the Permanent Force, but we dined at Colonel Porter's house and spent most of our time playing with the children. We left by boat at 9:30 p.m. and got back to Toronto at about 11:45 p.m, absolutely tired out with nothing doing and very pleased to get to bed. The next week in Toronto was the familiar round of sport, mainly golf, dancing, dinners and entertaining, with some more sightseeing. Mr. Tovell being an assiduous host throughout. A lunch with a Canadian family was remarkable. For the first time, Ken and Neves had an attempt at eating corn off the cob. On Friday, the 29th of August, after a cheerful Rotary lunch, a party of them went to an exhibition, having a picnic in the grounds and then watching the Empire pageant, including the squadron's field gun competition. Next day, Neves and Ken spent the forenoon making out table plans and place cards for the dinner and dance that they had arranged to give in the evening. Then we had a very quick lunch at the Tovells, and picking up Lola went down to the lake where we joined the rest of our party, made up of about 35, and boarded Mr. Matthews' yacht, the Annona, a glorious steam yacht. We spent the afternoon on board her, steaming round the lake and watching the sailing races off the exhibition, and got back at 1700 hours. We then all separated for shifting and met again at the Lambton GC, where we'd got a private room for our dinner. We numbered exactly 20, and I think it was a most successful affair. After dinner we danced there till 23:30, and then went to Child's, where we had a splendid supper, or breakfast, and got back to the hotel about 1 a.m, with Lola and the Tovells still in tow. There we had another supper, and woke up Edwards. The farewell in the elevator was terrible, even the elevator man breaking down. Leaving Toronto by train on the hottest, dustiest day it had been his misfortune to suffer, and returning to the ship in Quebec on the 1st of September, Ken had mixed feelings. However miserable we may be at having left Toronto behind us, we can now say we get home this month. It seems almost too good to be true, although I'm not sure I really want to go home. I wouldn't mind starting all over again. An exchange of telegrams between the Tovell family and the 3 sad sailors, Atkinson, Edwards and Neves, witnessed the kindness of the hosts and the gratitude of the sailors' mutually affectionate terms. The ship left Quebec on Tuesday the 2nd of September at 4 p.m, but anchored again at 17:15, as we couldn't carry high water with us going out of the river. We spent a pleasant night keeping watch in a 7-knot current. I had the middle, but were quite safe. The St. Lawrence is clearly a navigationally difficult river. Proceeding next day for Newfoundland, the squadron was indeed on the way home. The weather was beautiful, but with a distant nip in the air, making them feel quite strong again. It didn't last long. The next day they ran into a storm, and it really began to get quite rough, which Ken seems to have enjoyed. On Friday they ran into thick fog, necessitating at least 2 OOWs on the bridge. However, they hit nothing. On Saturday, the 6th of September, the fog had cleared, and they found their way round Newfoundland to Topsail, which is a very small village in Conception Bay, about 15 miles by land from St. John's. An extensive programme of dances and a route march were planned, but Ken went sick with his 4th dose of flu of the cruise and spent Sunday and Monday forenoon in bed. He returned to duty on Tuesday, though his duty seems to have been all leisure. Boat sailing in the forenoon and a trip to St. John's on the funny little railway. St. John's is a queer town on a very pretty little harbour which might have been anywhere on the coast of Cornwall, but except for a few parts of the town composed of dirty, ugly wooden houses, very unlike any other colonial town we visited. The people are all Irish or Scotch and very pleasant. On Wednesday, the 10th of September, Ken was on duty for the first time since he went to Toronto, but had nothing to do. He missed his second ceremonial route march, but it hardly counts as we only landed one company. The routine at this time was general drill in the forenoons and the boat sailing in the afternoons, 3 times a week. Ken remarks that we've got so many superfluous officers, I haven't got a job at all at general drill. Most days he seems to have been on duty, and the Government House dance wasn't a good one. Poor dancers, he had never met such a poor lot, though they were very nice, and he quite enjoyed himself. His overnight hosts, a Macpherson family, were extraordinarily nice. Next day he played golf with some of the family, despite pouring rain. Another week at topsail saw the ships at home and the sermon from the Bishop of Newfoundland and several spells of watchkeeping. Then, Tuesday, the 16th of September. During the night a terrible motorcar accident occurred on the topsail road, 6 people being killed, including Lieutenant Commander Callahan and Lieutenant Burrows of the Constance. Most frightfully sad, and has of course cancelled most of the arrangements for the rest of our stay. However, a football match between Hood and Repulse, the final of the Honolulu Cup, went ahead, Hood eventually winning at the 4th attempt after 3 draws. Next day there was a large picnic party with their hosts, an excellent day despite the fact that Ken cooked lunch. Thursday, the 18th of September. I left the ship at 08:30 for the funeral of Callahan and the Burrows up at St. John's. It poured with rain the whole time, and we spent about 2 hours slow marching and standing in the cemetery, complete in cocked hats, epaulettes, dress sword belts, etc., and got completely soaked through. However, the ceremony was very impressive. We supplied the field gun's crew and gun carriage and band, and the Constance supplied a firing party, an escort of over 200 men. We got back on board at about 1300 hours, pretty miserable, and spent the rest of the day doing nothing. The 3 last days in harbour saw much change in the weather. Wind on Friday morning so strong that communication with the shore was stopped. Perfectly glorious on Saturday and Sunday, with tender farewells all round between the 3 big ships and with the hosts ashore, Ken noted. Sunday, the 21st of September. It's very sad to think the cruise is now virtually over. Personally, I'd love to start all over again. I may say I was the last back into the boat, and so the last officer or man of the squadron to be ashore during the cruise. At 17:15 we sailed, still in glorious weather, and after clearing Conception Bay made straight for England, home and beauty. It took just over a week to reach home ports, and Ken's diary rather peters out, with a dinner in the gunroom and another with the Admiral and his staff. His only other recorded activity was examining boy seamen for promotion to ordinary seamen. In the practical part, knotting, splicing, sizing, etc., about which I knew absolutely nothing. In fact, I think they all knew more than I did. On Sunday, the 28th of September, the light cruisers rejoined and the squadron was complete for a very short period. At about 1700, the 2 Chatham LCs, Dragon and Danai, separated from us, each ship cheering as they passed. Then Repulse and Adelaide parted company for Portsmouth and Delhi. Dauntless and Hood proceeded to Plymouth, anchoring in Cawsand Bay at 2100. Monday, the 29th of September. The last and worst day of the cruise. We proceeded up harbour at 0500, and personally I've never been so sorry to see Plymouth. I'd volunteer to leave again on another such cruise tomorrow. So ended this world cruise, with its strange mixture of parties, balls, dances, entertaining of the fishing fleet in various ports, its crowds, its sports, its formal receptions and route marches, all interspersed with gunnery and power trials and the Admiral's inspections, aboard the world's largest and assumedly most powerful warship of its day, which was sunk with heavy loss of life in May 1941. She was the last battle cruiser built for the Royal Navy, and her end was similar to that of two of her predecessors at the Battle of Jutland.